Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Before we even jump into the material today, I just want to offer a quick blessing for you. May God deeply bless your day today, and may He bless your entire week ahead as you go about your life.
Absolutely.
So, to get us started, when you're building a physical structure, right, like a bridge or maybe a skyscraper, there's this golden rule in engineering regarding the materials you use.
Right, you generally want uniformity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like if you build with steel, you stick with steel. If you try to take something incredibly rigid, like, I don't know, cast iron, and you bolt it directly to something highly flexible that swells with ambient moisture like raw wood, you are basically engineering your own disaster.
Yeah, because under environmental pressure or, sudden changes in temperature, those two materials have completely different expansion and contraction rates.
Right.
The internal tension alone will literally tear the structure apart from the inside out.
Which actually brings us directly to the mission of this deep dive. Today we are looking at a historical blueprint for building a human bridge out of completely incompatible materials.
It's a huge undertaking.
It really is. We're exploring the intricate, super high-stakes dynamics of how people with fundamental, deeply embedded moral disagreements can actually coexist without tearing the community apart.
Which is something we desperately need today.
Oh, 100%. And we're drawing from an in-depth commentary on the Apostle Paul's letter to the Romans, specifically chapters 14 and 15, which honestly serve as a complete masterclass in conflict resolution.
Yeah, it is arguably one of the most brilliant, historically grounded treatises on sociological tension ever written.
It's just massive.
It is. And to really understand the gravity of what Paul is doing here, we have to look at the Christian church in Rome in the first century.
Set the stage for us. What's going on there?
Well, this community was completely fractured into two deeply entrenched factions. The text identifies them as the strong in faith and the weak in faith. Now, both camps were true, devout believers, that's key, but they were locked in this bitter clash over secondary, basically amoral issues.
Right, so we aren't talking about fundamental ethical breaches here. Like, no one is arguing over murder or theft.
No, not at all.
They were fighting over daily habits. Specifically, dietary laws like whether to eat meat or maintain strict vegetarianism and the observance of specific religious calendar days.
Exactly.
And I want to pause here because this is exactly why this matters to you listening right now. This is not some dusty history lesson about ancient Roman diets.
Right.
This is a highly practical framework for anyone navigating, say, a family dynamic or a neighborhood or even a corporate culture where people hold drastically different, completely uncompromising worldviews.
Yeah, because human nature doesn't change.
It really doesn't. The sociological tension that you might feel at a polarized Thanksgiving dinner, where everyone is walking on eggshells, that is the exact same tension they felt in Rome.
And to understand why a debate over, a dinner menu became so incredibly toxic, we really have to look at the specific historical and psychological makeup of these two factions.
Yeah, let's get into that. What caused the split?
So the church in Rome had recently undergone this massive demographic earthquake. A few years prior to Paul writing this, the Roman Emperor Claudius had actually expelled all the Jews from Rome.
Just completely kicked them out.
Yep, completely. It was over some civil disturbances. So the Jewish Christians obviously had to leave along with them, which meant the Roman church suddenly became entirely Gentile.
Wow, okay, so it's just a completely different demographic overnight.
Exactly. But then, about 5 years later, Claudius dies, the edict lapses, and the Jewish Christians return to Rome.
Oh, man. Which means they come back to a church that they actually helped found, only to discover the Gentiles have completely culturally taken it over.
Right. It's a totally different vibe.
I can imagine. The Jewish believers walk in and see these Gentile Christians completely ignoring the Sabbath, and worse, they're eating meat that the returning Jews find utterly appalling.
Precisely. And this is where those labels of weak and strong really come into play. The weak, who were mostly these returning Jewish converts, they weren't weak-willed or, feeble people.
Right.
Their weakness was specifically a lack of conscience liberty.
What does that mean in that context?
Well, in the ancient Roman world, almost all the meat sold in the Macellum, the public meat market, had first been ritually sacrificed in a pagan temple to gods like Jupiter or Mars.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
For the Jewish believers, eating that meat was basically tantamount to participating in demonic idolatry. It was absolutely terrifying to them. So they adopted strict vegetarianism just to avoid any accidental spiritual contamination.
Got it. So they were establishing this really rigid boundary just to protect their spiritual integrity. Meanwhile, you've got the strong faction, which, interestingly enough, Paul actually included himself in, and they operated on an entirely different theological logic.
They really did.
They understood that, hey, a pagan idol is literally just a block of wood or stone. It has absolutely no real power. Therefore, the meat offered to it is just cheap protein.
Right, it's just a steak.
Exactly. So they felt completely liberated from all the old kosher rituals and just ate whatever they wanted without a second thought. But, the fascinating dynamic here is how these opposing worldviews triggered very specific, highly destructive reactions.
Yeah, the commentary points out that both groups fell into distinct sins against one another. The weak sinned through judgment.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, they looked at the meat-eating Gentiles and condemned them as morally compromised. It was essentially zeal without understanding.
And what about the strong?
On the flip side, the strong sinned through contempt. They looked down their noses at the vegetarians, mocking them as backwards and superstitious. It was understanding without love. So the weak judged and the strong mocked.
Man, I was thinking about how this plays out today, and okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a modern dinner party where you have one guest who is strictly vegan. That's right. For deeply held ethical and environmental convictions.
Sure, very common scenario.
And they're sitting there quietly or maybe entirely visibly judging the person across the table who is enthusiastically carving into a massive factory-farmed steak. They're viewing that steak eater as basically morally bankrupt.
Oh, I've been at that table.
Right. Meanwhile, the steak eater is openly rolling their eyes, viewing the vegan as overly sensitive, rigid, and just a total killjoy. Both of them are sitting at the exact same table, but the atmosphere is completely poisoned.
That is the exact psychological environment of the Roman Church right there.
See, if I am at that dinner party, my immediate instinct is to figure out who is objectively right. Like, I want to debate the facts and declare a winner.
Right, we all want to be the one who's technically correct.
Exactly. And since Paul actually agreed with the theological premise of the strong, that all food is inherently clean, it kind of seems like he should have just written a letter telling the weak that their theology was outdated and they just needed to grow up and get over it.
That would be the easy way out, yeah.
So how does Paul neutralize this without just taking the side of the people who are technically correct?
Because Paul recognizes that winning an intellectual debate about food does absolutely nothing to heal a fractured community.
Oh, that's good.
His priority isn't theology trivia, it's mutual acceptance. He introduces this profound theological equalizer. He points out that God has already accepted both groups.
Wow.
Both the strict vegetarian and the carefree meat-eater were welcomed by God. Christ died and rose to be Lord of both the living and the dead. Therefore, when a believer sits in the judge's seat to condemn someone over a secondary issue, they are directly usurping God's role.
They're basically playing God.
Exactly. Paul completely shifts the paradigm here. He's saying, you don't have the right to play judge because everyone will face God's tribunal individually. You will not answer for what is on your brother's plate. You will only answer for the posture of your own heart.
That completely pulls the rug out from under the need to be right all the time. It really elevates the conversation from intellectual superiority to relational responsibility.
It absolutely does.
Which actually leads us to the antidote the source material introduces for this division. Because intellectual rightness isn't enough, Paul establishes a higher governing principle for how we exercise our freedoms, which is the law of love and this concept of the stumbling block.
Yeah, the stumbling block principle is huge. The strong are given a direct, non-negotiable command here. Do not use your liberty in a way that damages the fragile conscience of the weak.
So put limits on your own freedom.
Right. And the theological argument he makes is just devastatingly simple. Paul essentially asks the strong believer, if Jesus Christ loved this overly scrupulous, rigid brother enough to suffer an agonizing death on a cross for his redemption, how can you not love him enough to temporarily adjust your dinner menu?
Oof. I mean, that frames the demand for our personal rights as incredibly petty.
It really exposes the ego, doesn't it?
It does. And there is a specific historical anecdote in the commentary that brings the absolute absurdity of this mutual judgment into sharp relief. It involves these two famous Victorian-era preachers in England,
Yeah.
Charles Spurgeon and Joseph Parker.
Oh, yes. Two towering figures of the 19th century pulpit who had a very public, very bitter falling out.
Yeah. So Spurgeon harshly judged Parker because Parker frequently attended the theater.
Right.
In Spurgeon's really rigid view, the theater was this unspiritual, worldly environment, and a minister had absolutely no business being there.
But there is a catch.
A huge catch. The tragic irony is that Spurgeon himself was famous for smoking cigars, which was a practice that countless other Christians of his day judged as a terrible fleshly vice.
Oh, the hypocrisy is amazing.
Right. So you have Spurgeon puffing on a cigar, condemning Parker for watching a play. It just perfectly illustrates the psychological blindness we all have. We demand absolute grace for our own preferred liberties while ruthlessly policing the liberties of others.
It is the ultimate manifestation of noticing the speck in your brother's eye while ignoring the log in your own.
Definitely.
The human ego is remarkably adept at categorizing our own vices as freedoms and other people's freedoms as vices.
That's so true. But, if we apply Paul's stumbling block principle literally, I do see a massive practical problem here.
Okay, what's that?
If I constantly limit my own behavior based on what might offend someone else, aren't I just enabling the most rigid, easily offended person in the room?
Ah, I see what you mean.
Like, doesn't the whole community just get dragged down to the lowest common denominator of legalism?
Yeah.
It honestly feels like being held hostage by fragility.
Yeah, that is the natural fear. But what's fascinating here is how Paul addresses that exact tension by reframing the issue around proportion and priority.
Okay.
In Romans 14:17, he states that the kingdom of God is not a matter of eating and drinking, but of righteousness, peace, and joy in the Holy Spirit.
Right. Keeping the main thing the main thing.
Exactly. He is telling the strong, look, if you insist on your right to eat meat or drink wine or exercise whatever freedom you have at the expense of your brother's spiritual survival, you have completely lost the plot. You are making a trivial thing central and a central thing trivial.
So it's not actually about surrendering your freedom to a legalist. It's about voluntarily giving up your right of way because you value the person more than the practice. You are choosing peace and joy over proving a point.
Exactly. And because this level of radical self-limitation goes against every single human instinct of self-preservation, Paul doesn't just point to a philosophy.
Right. He points to a person.
Yes, he points directly to the historical reality of Christ as the blueprint. Christ did not please himself. He absorbed the reproaches and burdens of others. Therefore, the strong are obligated to bear the burdens of the weak, not to flatter their own egos, but to actively build up their neighbor.
Which is incredible. And Paul actually views his own unique vocation as a mirror of this Christ-like sacrifice.
Yeah, he does.
The text highlights a deeply surprising metaphor Paul uses to describe his ministry. I mean, he is the designated apostle to the Gentiles, the non-Jewish world.
Right.
Yet he describes his work using intensely Jewish priestly temple language. He refers to his ministry as a priestly service, and he calls the converted Gentiles an acceptable offering.
It's such a striking juxtaposition. Paul is taking the exclusive, highly restricted imagery of the Jerusalem temple and applying it to the very people who are historically excluded from it.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The commentary notes that Paul preached to these Gentiles by word and works. Let's push this into a modern framework for a second.
Okay, let's do it.
Think of Paul's ministry like watching a film that requires both an audio track and a visual component to be understood.
Okay, I follow.
The word he's preaching is the audio track. It explains the theology, the history, the meaning of the cross. But the Gentiles didn't have the centuries of Jewish Torah, the prophets, or the cultural background to just hear the audio track and automatically understand it.
Right, they didn't have the paradigm.
They completely lacked the theological vocabulary, so they fundamentally required the visual track, his works, the miracles, the tangible power of the Spirit to actually comprehend the message.
That makes total sense.
If you mute the audio, you just have unexplained magic tricks. If you turn off the screen, you have a disembodied voice speaking a foreign theological language.
Yeah.
He literally needed both to bring the Gentiles to obedience.
That synthesis of word and deed is crucial, and when we connect that back to his priestly metaphor, the depth of what Paul accomplished really becomes clear. Well, the commentary carefully notes that in the Christian church, there are no literal priests or animal sacrifices anymore. Those were ancient shadows that totally dissolved when the reality of Christ arrived.
Right.
Instead, Paul views the converted Gentiles themselves as his living sacrifice offered up to God.
Wow. To really understand how breathtaking that theological shift is, You have to look at the architecture of the actual Jewish temple in Jerusalem.
The physical layout, yeah.
Archaeologists have literally found the warning stones that formed the dividing wall in the temple courts. Those stones explicitly stated that any Gentile who crossed the barrier into the inner courts would have themselves to blame for their ensuing death.
It was a literal death sentence.
Literally. For centuries, Gentiles were banned under threat of execution from participating in the inner life of God's people. And now, Paul is declaring that through the gospel, the very people warned by those stones are no longer the outsiders. They are the holy offering itself, resting directly on the altar.
It is a complete inversion of the old religious hierarchy. The outsiders have become the offering. It just vividly illustrates the radical, unprecedented unity Paul is trying to forge between Jewish and Gentile believers in Rome.
But, Paul was a realist.
Yeah.
He knew that this profound, high-minded theological unity couldn't just remain a lofty idea debated in letters.
Ideas aren't enough.
Exactly. It had to become physical. It had to cause something tangible.
Yeah.
So he actually engineered a massive cross-continental financial project to force this unity into physical reality. We're talking about the Jerusalem collection.
Ah, yes. Economics and theology deeply intersecting.
Seriously intersecting.
Yeah.
Looking at Paul's itinerary, the logistics are just staggering. He states he has finished his foundational church planting work in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Yep.
And his ultimate dream is to finally visit the church in Rome and then have them resource him for a new mission further west into Spain.
That was the goal.
But before he can go west to Rome, he has to take a massive, dangerous detour east back to Jerusalem. He is doing this to personally deliver a huge financial collection gathered from the Gentile churches in modern-day Greece and Turkey.
Yeah, and the commentator John Stott breaks down the specific mechanics of this offering, emphasizing that this was not merely a first-century disaster relief fund.
Even though there was a famine, right?
Yes, the Jewish believers in Judea were facing severe famine and crushing taxation, leaving them completely destitute. But Stott argues this was profoundly theological. The Gentiles weren't just giving a charitable gift. They were actively paying a spiritual debt.
But wait, paying a debt implies an obligation. How does a Gentile living over in Greece owe a financial debt to a Jew in Jerusalem?
Because the Gentiles had freely partaken in the spiritual wealth of the Jews.
Ah,
Think about it. The Messiah, the covenants, the scriptures, the gospel itself, all of it flowed outward from the Jewish lineage.
right, it all started there.
Therefore, Paul argued, since the Gentiles had received the ultimate spiritual inheritance from the Jews, they were morally obligated to return material support in their time of poverty. It was the physical, economic proof that the dividing wall had actually fallen, and they were now one unified family.
That is basically a holy exchange program. It's designed as the ultimate trust-building exercise between two historically hostile groups. The Jewish believers gave spiritual life, and the Gentile believers are returning material survival.
Exactly.
But analyzing this from a logistical standpoint, it is a terrifying mission. He is literally carrying a massive fortune across pirate-infested waters.
Very dangerous.
And worse, he is bringing it into a politically unstable Judea. Paul explicitly begs the Romans to join him in wrestling, agonizing prayer regarding this delivery.
He is scared.
If this is such a beautiful, God-ordained mission of unity, why is he treating it like a suicide mission?
Because Paul deeply understood the socio-political powder keg he was walking into. Judea was absolutely seething with violent nationalism at the time.
Right, the Roman occupation.
Exactly. The Zealots despised Roman occupation and hated absolutely anything Gentile. To the extreme factions in Jerusalem, Paul was viewed as a radical traitor who was destroying Jewish traditions by embracing Gentiles.
Oh man, so they already hated him.
Totally. So bringing Gentile money into that hyper-nationalistic environment could so easily be viewed as an insult, or worse, an intentional provocation. That is why the prayer he requests isn't just a passive, wish for safe travels.
Right, he calls for a Trinitarian prayer, praying to the Father through the Son by the love of the Spirit.
Yes. And the mechanics of that prayer are vital. He is praying to the Father as the sovereign authority over all human hearts, through the Son, who is the sole mediator capable of actually uniting Jew and Gentile, and by the active power of the Spirit, who generates the love necessary to overcome that deep ethnic hatred. Paul knows that forging actual unity between divided people always meets the fiercest earthly and spiritual resistance. The opposing forces, whether political nationalism, religious legalism, or spiritual darkness, they will fight tooth and nail to keep that bridge from being built.
So, synthesizing all of this, the core takeaway for us today is a radical redefinition of freedom.
Definitely.
True freedom isn't just the autonomy to do whatever you want, whenever you want, just because you technically have the right to do so. True freedom is possessing the internal strength and maturity to voluntarily limit your own rights out of love for someone else.
That's beautifully said.
It's the recognition that whether we consider ourselves the strong or the weak in our families or our workplaces, we are not the judge of our brother or sister. We all answer to the exact same Lord.
That is the central thesis. And there is a final, highly provocative historical footnote in the source material that builds perfectly on Paul's grand itinerary.
Ooh, what is it?
Remember, his fervent, completely God-honoring plan was to deliver the collection, visit Rome to be refreshed by their company, and then launch a glorious new mission to Spain.
Right. He had completely pure motives.
He did. However, history records how that plan actually unfolded. Paul's fears about Jerusalem were entirely justified.
Oh, no.
Yeah, he was attacked in the temple, nearly beaten to death by a mob, and arrested by the Romans. He eventually did arrive in Rome, but not as a celebrated independent missionary on a voluntary layover. He arrived in Rome as a prisoner in chains, waiting to be tried for his life by Caesar.
That is just a staggering detour.
It challenges us to deeply consider our own expectations, you know? How do we react when our most pure, well-intentioned, God-honoring plans for our lives, our careers, or our communities are answered through completely unexpected, incredibly painful, and restrictive detours?
Yeah.
Paul still made it to Rome to preach the gospel, but his mode of transportation was a prison ship.
Wow. That is a thought that will definitely linger for you, listening right now.
Yeah.
We started this deep dive talking about the sheer impossibility of building a bridge out of vastly different conflicting materials, how the inherent tension should just tear the structure apart.
Right.
But what we've uncovered in Paul's letter is that when the mortar holding those incompatible materials together is their radical self-sacrificial love and mutual acceptance of Christ, the structure doesn't collapse.
It holds.
It actually becomes exponentially stronger because of the differences. It transforms from a divided community into a living sacrifice.
A bridge that can actually withstand the pressures of a polarized world.
Well, that is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us as we unpack the deep sociology and theology of Romans. Keep seeking, keep learning, and as always, God blesses all the listeners. We'll see you on the next deep dive.